natürlich unterschiedlich. Hier in Kiew, in der Umgebung, in der Flugabwehr ein bisschen anders als an der Front. Dort ist die Lage wirklich extrem schlecht. Die Russen rücken an vielen Orten permanent und jeden Tag weiter vor. Und ich sage es oft, es mangelt an allem. Es mangelt an Munition, es mangelt an Waffen, es mangelt an Soldaten. Wir hören davon, dass Soldaten abhauen, sich das Leben nehmen. Die Stimmung ist extrem schlecht.
The defense of the armed forces of Ukraine is in a deep crisis. This was the opening sentence of the latest frontline report from Medusa outlet. Russian troops, they say, continue their offensive in the south of Donbass, in the Kursk region, on the Kupiansk front, on the cities of Siversk and Chasiv Yar, and even in the Zaporizhia region, where there was a calm for several months. Yevhen Dicky, a former platoon commander of the Adar battalion, believes that Russia's reserves can sustain the war for another year, which is why he thinks that Russia aims to defeat Ukraine before their army collapses. His analysis of the front was quite similar to Medusa's. In his words, he told Ukrainian TV that the Russians are now advancing wherever they can. They are trying to do this in the Kursk region, near Kupiansk, in the Donetsk region, in the Pokrovsk and Kurakhove directions, and are also trying to test the Zaporizhia direction. The only area, he said, where the occupiers are not trying to advance is by forcing the Dnipro River, because, he claims, they realize that they do not have the strength to do so. He admits that in the Donetsk region, the Russians are having, and I quote, quite serious success. In the Kupiansk direction, he said in quotations, "We are experiencing painful attacks. They are already on the western bank of the Oskil River, and the fighting is not in the Kupiansk direction, but let's be honest, for the city of Kupiansk." And the meaning of this last statement was perhaps lost in translation. The former platoon commander, without evidence, claims that the Russian army will run out of reserves eventually. In fact, this has been the narrative that the Ukrainian command has been selling to its Western backers for over a year to induce them to continue the flow of their taxpayers' money into the black hole of corruption that is Ukraine. The Russians have about a year's worth of reserves for a war of this intensity, he told the Ukrainian outlet. And knowing this, they went for a very risky, but unfortunately so far, successful strategy, which he described as the last and decisive battle. On the other hand, Ukraine's reserves, he claims, will, if nothing changes, last for a mere 6 months. He viewed that Russia's strategy is built to push down faster than their army collapses. Therefore, the Russian strategy is to advance despite losses in all directions at the same time. Right now, he admitted that they have a chance to push us over the winter. In his opinion, Russia has a real chance to do so successfully because, and I quote again, "Our mobilization has failed and the government has done nothing to remedy the situation." Meanwhile on the front, unless you have been living under a rock or perhaps under the delusions of Western and Ukrainian propaganda.
Maybe most importantly, also thanks to American leadership, Ukraine has prevailed and Russia has not won. And obviously we have to do more to make sure that Ukraine can stay in the fight and is able to roll back as much as possible the Russian onslaught and to prevent Putin from being successful in Ukraine.
You will know, especially if you have been subscribed to my channel, that the assault on Kurakhove, the most important logistics hub of southern Donbass, has begun. Russian troops have entered the city from the east and reached almost the city center. Another unit of the armed forces of the Russian Federation broke into the village of Dalne. On the southeastern outskirts of Kurakhove. Ukrainian troops south of the city were under the threat of encirclement. At the same time, units of the Russian armed forces reached the eastern part of Kupiansk and the center of Chasiv Yar. So today I will continue to report on what I consider to be the beginning of the final Russian offensive across the entire front to institute a final collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces. And for those of you who are already familiar with my channel, you know what I'm already going to ask you to do at this juncture. But for newcomers, after you subscribe, leave a little support with a super thanks donation. And the last point to note is that some of the cities named on the maps in today's video may have incorrect English translations. So bear with me and let's get into it. The assault on Kurakhove, the most important logistics hub of southern Donbass, has begun. The Russian unit, similar to Kupiansk, was able to break deep into residential buildings from the most protected direction, that is, from the east through the recently captured village of Uspenivka. From there, Russian troops broke through to the southern outskirts of Kurakhove, to the village of Dalne, where they were temporarily stopped by a tank counterattack of the armed forces of Ukraine. But the main blow to the Ukrainian defenders by the Russians is on the northern and southern flanks of the Ukrainian defense. North of Kurakhove, Russian troops, having captured Selidove and Gornyak, are advancing to the western end of the Kurakhove reservoir along two routes, one along the coast from Kurakhove and Gornyak, and the other from Selidove from the south. In the north, the Russian armed forces reached the village of Uspenivka, just 5 kilometers from the western end of the reservoir. South of Kurakhove, from Ugledar, another group is advancing in 3 columns to Kurakhove. In October, they captured the villages where the battalions of the armed forces of Ukraine withdrew after the loss of Ugledar, that is, the villages of Shakhtarsk, Novoyukrenka, and Bohoyavlenka. Then the Russian units approached the village of Chudove, behind which, in Uspenivka, there is an important road intersection. From there, it's a mere 10 kilometers to Kurakhove. The situation of the armed forces of Ukraine in Uspenivka is complicated by the withdrawal of the Russian forces to the rear in Dalne. BBC Russian confirmed the Russian breakthrough by the 20th Motorized Rifle Division to the village of Dalne on November 13th. This event caused the Ukrainian military analyst Konstantin Mashovets to warn that the defense of Kurakhove is probably entering its final stage. As a result, all Ukrainian troops east of Uspenivka are under threat of encirclement. There, significant forces of the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to stop Russian units storming villages on the banks of the Suky Yali River. Probably, the remaining villages will soon have to be left to the Ukrainian defenders. At the same time, the southern group of the armed forces of the Russian Federation will clearly come to Kurakhove later than the northern comrades, as on the south, they need to overcome not only the Suky Yali River, but also the heights behind it. Between the northern and southern groups, there is a reservoir with a dam on the Vovcha River at its western tip. On November 11th, the dam controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine was blown up, most likely by Ukrainian sappers. Probably, the command of the armed forces of Ukraine fears, first of all, the breakthrough of the Russian troops from the north. Perhaps it allows the withdrawal of its troops from the northern shore of the reservoir. To the south of the Vovcha River are Kurakhove and the most important Donetsk-Zaporizhia road, which Ukrainian troops plan to defend to the last.
Ух ты, блядь. Отбиваємо штурм Новомихайловськ. Перву відбили, 3 техніки підбили.
This gradual Russian encirclement of key fortress cities has been a staple of the Russian offensive tactic. With the loss of Avdiivka in February of 2024 and the subsequent advance of Russian troops on a wide section of the front in Donbass, Ukrainian units repeatedly found themselves in a situation where they were threatened with encirclement. Such was the fate of Avdiivka, Ugledar, and many other places. In the case of Kurakhove, the situation for the Ukrainian forces is complicated by several factors at once. The lack of good roads, except for the one that is currently being shelled, the restriction of freedom of maneuver, and most notably, by a wide front of the Russian offensive and numerous strikes, each of which, if timed successfully, can cut off some of the defenders from the main forces. The Ukrainian army is forced to repel constant threats in conditions of unfavorable terrain, numerical superiority of the Russian attackers, and unreliability of its own forces, at least half of which, according to BBC Russian service, comprises undertrained territorial defense troops.
Есть попадание, есть поражение.
The bridgehead of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Kursk region continues to shrink. Ukrainian troops left the Kurakhove district, where in October they tried to respond with their offensive to the attacks of the Russian armed forces to the west and east of Sudza. There, Russian troops reached the state border. Russian troops, however, have never been able to knock out the armed forces of Ukraine from the Olginskaya Grove, which is the forest between the district center of Kurakhove and Sudza, and likely located somewhere in this area of the ISW's map. Nevertheless, this was the area that President Putin said that 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded in his statement at the recent BRICS summit.
Some of the Ukrainian units that have mounted an incursion into the Kursk region have been blocked and encircled. This group totals around 2,000 people. There are attempts at deblocking that from outside. There are also attempts at a breakthrough from the inside. Right now, the Russian troops are proceeding to eliminate this group of forces that has been encircled.
According to Medusa, the armed forces of Ukraine supply a ledge on the roads from Malaya Loknya, and Russian troops are now storming the forest head-on. The armed forces of the Russian Federation still manage to gradually push the Ukrainian defenses to the west of Sudza. Despite the tank counterattacks from the Ukrainian defenders, the Russians are still attempting to gain a foothold in Uspenivka. They also attack Malaya Loknya, which is the most important defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in this region. Russian forces also stormed the village of Darino. If it were lost, it would cost the armed forces of Ukraine dearly, as the village is located on the eastern bank of the Snagost River, on the shore of which the Ukrainian army tried to hold its defense. Russian troops are also attacking the bridgehead in the Kursk region from the east. In early November, they tried to enter the village of Plehovo, south of Sudza, with a column of armored vehicles and lost some equipment. But then they suddenly bypassed the village from the north, crossing the Sel River by boat, and started a battle on the northern outskirts of Plehovo. In general, the Russian offensive in the Kursk region, however, has slowed down, and as the front line shrinks, the resistance of the armed forces of Ukraine increases for now. And in my last video, in which I did an in-depth analysis of the Russian casualties based on a recent report from the BBC Russian service in ties with Media Zona, many of you asked quite logically, well, what about the Ukrainian losses?
Блядь, я тобі ще раз повторюю. Нам сказали, що наших 200-х потрібно привезти сюди, на евакуацію.
Well, I have a report on that, but only specific to the Kursk region, and it comes from Russian media Sputnik. They claim that in the past day alone, the Ukrainians have lost 255 soldiers. This was down slightly from the report on November 11th, where they claimed Ukraine had lost 300 in the past day. So if you watch my last report, which I suggest you do now, you will compare this to the figure of 152 Russian losses per day across the entire front, and not just in one region like Ukraine is incurring, according to the BBC Russian service. So what is going on in the front lines of Ukraine is now being described as a collapse, perhaps a slow motion collapse, and this is admitted even in Western media. But the collapse isn't just on the front lines of Ukraine. Rather, there seems to be a collapse in the Western support for Ukraine. In Germany, a pensioner did an impromptu interview with German TV on the roadside and spoke passionately about the illogicality of continued German support for Ukraine.
Ehrlich gesagt, das mit den Ukraine-Hilfen, wenn Sie hier, ich bin hier Lesepatin und ich sehe, was in der Schule los ist. Oder die Wartezeiten bei den Ärzten oder in den Krankenhäusern. Und auch wenn Sie sehen, wie die Ärzte arbeiten. Ich meine, da musste, oder die Brücken, die zusammenfallen und die Straßen. Und ich meine, das Geld muss hier angelegt werden. Das sind doch deutsche Steuerzahler, die hier einzahlen. Also ich verstehe das alles nicht, ja. Und ich meine, Krieg, die müssen beendet werden. Ich meine, möchten Sie in den Krieg gehen? Möchten Sie einen Arm weniger haben oder ein Bein weniger? Nein, das geht nicht. Eine ganze Generation von jungen Russen, von jungen Ukrainer sterben. Für was? Weil einige Politiker nicht sprechen können miteinander. Also ich finde das Wahnsinn. Entschuldigen Sie.
Then in England, we hear the words of British media personality Kate Hopkins, summing up the collapse of the Ukraine narrative across the world.
now watching the collapse of the Ukraine narrative in real time, and it's a glorious thing to watch, particularly through popular culture. Rod Stewart in Germany tried putting up a massive Ukraine flag and images of the powder-sniffing Zelensky, at which point the German crowd erupted into boos and hisses, and it was fun to see. In the football, Romania just thrashed Ukraine and the crowd went wild. Listening to the Romanian anthem was a terrific thing, and perhaps we can see a little less now of Ukraine being forced to put into everything. And finally, we have Putin saying that he's very happy to have a peace deal to stop the war if Europe could just stop being arseholes, at which point Europe and its leaders decided it'd be much better to have a nuclear Armageddon than just to cede to some of Putin's requests. So you are now watching the fall of the lie that was fed to you, and I ask all of you with Ukraine flags in your profile, could you please freaking take them down?
And so I ask, are we therefore really in the final months of the Ukraine war?